One thing that I think might help the listener is to sort of construct a square. This is something where we often start when we're teaching Kant's Metaphysics and Epistemology. And just make yourself a square that has 4 parts and think about what does it mean for something to be analytic a priori, synthetic a priori, analytic a posteriori, and synthetic a posteriori. And that might help you to be able to follow the discussion as we switch from talking about analytic a priori and synthetic a priori and so on and so forth. So if you make yourself that little square...
And in fact, there will be one on the website.
Oh, okay.
Seth
if there's going to be one on the website,
us.
then do you want to go ahead and describe it? That way it'll be in the same order and so on?
No, go right ahead. You do your version.
So analytic a priori propositions are going to be basically things that fall with the law of contradiction, right? And part of the claim for Kant, as I think it was Marx said earlier, is basically to say that, look, Hume didn't draw these distinctions finely enough, and that's the reason why he got confused and thought that causality was something that we basically impose on that, we can't really believe exists justifiably, but if we stick to these definitions well, then we won't fall into Hume's trap. So synthetic a priori propositions, that's basically where we're going to spend the majority of our time today talking, I would imagine. And he gives physics and math as being examples of that. And then we have analytic a posteriori propositions, which pretty much are going to remain blank, right? I mean, I can't imagine what would be an analytic a posteriori proposition.
Nothing.
Right. A priori is prior to experience. A posteriori is after or through experience. So since analytic is true by definition, we might hear about the definition through experience. Somebody tells it to us, but that's not how we confirm an analytic truth.
Right. And then we have synthetic a posteriori propositions, which is basically going to be experience, broadly construed.
Actually, Wes, this is something I remembered from the previous podcast where we were talking about Hume, and you did mention that for Kant, I think we were using the all bachelors are unmarried example, and you said for him that was an analytic a priori proposition. I thought it was analytic a posteriori. So let's back it up just a little bit and just kind of slow it down a little bit. So concepts can come from experience or concepts can come from reason. If they come from experience, we call them as being grounded in a posteriori or empirical. And if they come from reason, we call them a priori.
Or pure.
Or pure, right. So the whole endeavor of the critique of pure reason, what Kant is trying to figure out is whether or not it's possible to have any knowledge, interesting knowledge of the world through pure reason. We know that we get interesting knowledge of the world through our experience. In other words, a posteriori. We do get useful and interesting experiences of the world. That's where we learn things like Azura lives in Austin and Seth lives in Austin and Mark is the father of 2 kids. Those are the kinds of things that we learn through our experience that are, when I say interesting, what Kant calls synthetic. So you have to go out and kind of check and verify, if you will, but you're gaining something from your concept. The concept of Mark, if you know Mark, you have to go find out that he has 2 kids, and it adds to your idea of Mark, so to speak.
Unless my name was Mark 2 Kids Linsenmeyer.
That's right. Unless it was contained in the concept of Mark 2 Kids Linsenmeyer, that he had 2 kids. So then you can get ideas through so-called pure reason, or at least that's the question that we have. Can you gain anything interesting? Can you learn anything about the world through pure reason? And the first thing you find out is that you can learn some stuff about the world through pure reason without doing too much work, but it turns out to be not very interesting. And that's an analytic truth. So in other words, if I say A equals A, I'm saying something that's true, and I'm doing it through pure reason because there are no A's in the world that I'm going to verify. I just simply am stating its definition. So that's true. It's just not particularly exciting. And one of the things that's really critical here is that Kant thinks that once you gain something from experience, like you learn a concept through experience, you can then have analytic a priori truths about that experience concept without referring back to it.
Right.
So in other words, once you learn that the definition of a bachelor is somebody who is not married, you can then say analytic a priori, bachelors are unmarried men. By definition, bachelors are unmarried men. And that is a phrase that even though you have the concept through experience, the proposition that bachelors are unmarried men is analytic a priori. You're making that through pure reason.
Right. That's
but it's
important.
just not very interesting. So The question is there any way that you can take any concept that you have, whether you got it through experience or whether you got it through pure reason, and add something new to it, learn something new without recourse to experience, just through pure reason alone? Like, could you come up with something and saying, like, there are no bachelors, or there are 27 bachelors, or there are more than 500 bachelors, just through pure reason alone without recourse to actually going and verifying an experience?
And again, I think we have to look at why he's doing this, because he's reflecting on these philosophers that we've read some of, like Leibniz and Plato, and seeing the kind of things that they were coming up with. Or again, I'll mention Descartes' arguments, like his argument for the existence of God, which is an old one, this ontological argument, which just looks at the concept of God and analyze this concept and says, oh, it's such a great concept of infinity, and because everything must be brought about by something that has at least as much reality as it, and this concept is so awesome that it must have been actually brought about by the actual God. That's not looking out at the world and saying, I see that God caused this, or you can't even get the principle that, everything only comes from something that's greater than it from experience. It's a pure a priori argument.
And Leibniz, for instance, we saw with our podcast in the monadology, he thinks that everything is analytic, including Marx having 2 kids. So that was his solution to the problem.
Explain that a little more, if you're going to bring it up.
Everything has a concept. Every monad has a concept, and every predicate, including relational predicates, like so-and-so is the father of so-and-so, those sorts of predicates are within the concept of that thing, because he was disturbed by the ontology of relations, in the same way that Hume was worried about causality, because it's not like when you say father of, there's an object out there that corresponds to father of. That's the problem that leads to all of this, that these synthetic, relational...
But there is an object out there. It's sperm.
Yeah, but the problem that these synthetic relational assertions are hard to, let's say, model metaphysically or something like that. So he wanted, his solution was just to do away with that and say, in fact, there's a concept that everything is included in analytically.
Now, what do you guys think about this? So this is his target, is this kind of philosophy, and saying, and he says this is the only kind of metaphysics that's possible. If you think you could do any metaphysics based on just looking at experience itself, that's just obviously ludicrous. Whereas we just had an episode not that long ago on physics, right, which seemed to be about metaphysics, and it's people like measuring and studying things and coming up with conjectures about the way reality actually is. That seems like it's metaphysics, it's empirical.
Well, I think that we have to refer back to the Hume discussion, because it seems like he took Hume's argument against the possibility of metaphysics very seriously. That, to go back to Azura's point about the foursquare, which we'll post a little graphic of on the website, Kant is saying that he wants to make metaphysics a science, and that means being able to get access to information, synthetic, useful, whatever information about the world through pure reason. And he says, but we have a devastating critique of this possibility as represented by Hume's demonstration that there is no way to get cause and effect as a concept synthetically through experience. And basically what he says is it's a devastating critique if you're trying to do metaphysics empirically, if you're trying to discover things that way. But it is not that, he's going to respond to that and show that it's possible to get synthetic concepts through pure reason. And so, Mark, you had mentioned the enterprise of doing metaphysics as this exercise in doing synthetic a priori reasoning and not getting through experience. And I think what Kant thinks is that Hume proved sort of unequivocally that doing metaphysics through empirical data, whether synthetic or otherwise, is not possible. And that was the significance of what he saw in Hume's work. And that he felt like many of the other, he mentions that other people did not understand the significance of what Hume proved.
Well, he definitely doesn't want your metaphysics to be made up of probabilities. He thinks that's poor and pathetic. He's not going to be satisfied with that. And that's all you can get out of experience. If you're basing things on induction. I guess I had a subsequent thought to, just going back to our discussion of Hume for a second. Hume was saying you can't get the concept of causality through reason itself. And you can't get it straight from experience. So it's something that builds up over time. And in fact, it's just instinct that when we see things repeatedly, and in fact, it's dumb instinct because animals have it, babies have it. And so we were saying from that really Hume doesn't have any way of allowing causality, Wes was saying, to play the role that it needs to in science, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So you could almost say that causality for Hume is a kind of conditioning.
Yep. Exactly.
Right.
But my thought subsequent to that was, can't reason make some use of it as a theoretical construct after the fact? So maybe we have this idea in the first place through some dumb instinct. And in fact, I might deny that we really have the notion, or that babies or animals have the notion that everything has a cause, right? This universal. All we know is that something happens and then something else happens and we get an expectation. That doesn't even mean everything has a cause. That just means sometimes things cause other things. And like if something bad happens to you, you think about what you were doing when that bad thing happens and you try not to do that again. Or if something good happens.
You think there's something in the world without a cause, Mark?
I'm thinking that what instinct tells us, I don't think instinct makes this fancy universal claim like that. We get this idea of causality from this dumb instinct, but then as scientists, we say, let's just assume for the sake of making useful theories that this causality is everywhere. And then, in fact, when we run into something like we were talking about in quantum physics, where maybe, wow, it looks like, there's this thing violates the laws of causality, then we're really surprised and it challenges us, which to me just shows that this notion of universal causality is a very well-grounded hypothesis. Whereas Kant says if it's going to be useful for science at all, it has to be certain. It has to be something that's a priori certain, necessary. If it has to be that, then the only way it could be there is because you sort of impose that necessity, is his claim. Does it have to be certain?
Okay, I think I see what you're saying.
I think that it's important to remember here that Kant is trying to make metaphysics seem on par with physics as it was understood at his time, right? So he's thinking of Newtonian physics as being the only possible physical model. Whereas now we know that Newtonian physics, works in certain circumstances, but doesn't work overall. So I think for us as contemporary thinkers, the idea that maybe science is an approximation of the truth, in the sense that we might say that it, kind of like a logarithm, attempts to reach the truth, but maybe never gets there because there is no truth, or maybe just never gets there. I think that as contemporary thinkers, we're going to be far more open to that possibility than Kant would have been.
Yes, asymptotal is the word you're looking for.
Thank you. It's been a while since I've been in a math class.
I think this is about more than certainty, and this is still a popular debate in philosophy of science, and your average scientist would think it's absurd to say that there's no such thing really as causality. Oh, the phenomenon X didn't really cause phenomenon Y. It's all in the head, but we're just going to assume that because it's useful. They would find that horrific. So Kant wants to, if you don't have his aim, if you're not worried about the objectivity, and part of, by the way, the worry about objectivity is just making a distinction between thoughts that are completely subjective, like, oh, this tastes sweet, when someone else is going to find it tasting sour, and those that are objective. So if you don't have that worry and you're not concerned about whether there's some real component of the world which undergirds causality, then you're not going to go this direction. That's a premise. And this whole enterprise is built on that premise. The premise that there must be some real component in the world which explains or gives a foundation to causality, and then the premise that math and science are specimens of a priori synthetic knowledge.
Should we walk through the steps of his theory of mind? Just talk about sensibility and then understanding and reason, just to get that on the table to enrich this?
Sure.
So sensibility, Wes, why don't you tell us about, Kant said that sensibility gives us a priori necessary knowledge of time and space the way they are.
Yeah.
They're the form of our experience.
Yeah. So sensibility is an answer to this question, how is pure mathematics possible? What that means is, how is mathematics possible as a genuine science or a genuine branch of knowledge, where its genuineness must have that element of necessity that we just talked about with causality. In the same way that causality can't come in intuitively, can't be sucked in through the senses, so space and time itself can't. Rather than being an object out there that we can observe, space and time are, in a way, forms of everything that we empirically observe. One of the important assertions here is that we don't have access to things in themselves. And again, he's thinking on that Lockean model where you explain away color in terms of an interaction of, say, the eye and waves bouncing off an external object. Well, here, it's the interaction of the mind and the way the world affects the mind and creates all of these representations. But what we have are representations. We don't have this unmediated access to things in themselves. And so you get what he calls sensibility of time and space, which again are these formal elements that apply to everything that we can empirically experience, as opposed to properties of things in themselves, or as themselves observable things that we can get from the outside.
This is his equivalent to what Hume called impressions, right? This sensibility. Just the raw sense data that is coming at you, which are just unconnected images or whatever. And as long as you're dealing with sensibility, so this part of the mind that really has to do with how the senses are constructed. And he thinks the only things the senses impose on this information is this form of time and space. And he's even more specific than that, because space only applies to things in outer sense, whereas time applies to your reflections and your own thoughts as well.
So here's something that I've been thinking about for a while. I wonder what Kant would say about a being whose ways of processing their sensibilities were substantially different from our own, okay? What about a dog's notion of time? What I mean here is, when a dog goes and sniffs at a tree, it seems that it's getting impressions of things that were there before, right? So although my experience of time is very discrete but continuous, in the sense that, I experience this moment and then this moment and then this moment, and I experience them as sort of very small moments that all flow together, I imagine that perhaps a dog might experience time in a more overlapping fashion, right? Where the dog can say, well, this object is no longer here, but it once was, and that once is more recent than this other object because I smell this urine more strongly than I smell this other urine.
Yeah, I think that's a good example because it highlights the sense in which different beings will have different cognitive structures, and so they'll have different appearances. And those appearances come about through some sort of interaction with things in themselves, which we don't have direct access to. The dog doesn't have direct access to. Whatever it has access to is this product of its own making to some extent.
Well, and one of the things that I wanted to add is that at one point, Kant seems to give this argument that the reason we have integer arithmetic is in part because we experience time as being a unit of time and then a consistent unit of time later and then a consistent unit of time later. And that's sort of how we build this concept.
Which seems entirely phenomenologically wrong to me.
Exactly. And actually, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that in Roman times, the notion of an hour was actually a fluctuating concept. So you would have your lunch hour, and that could last however long it took you to eat lunch. And then you might have a different hour, which would actually, in terms of, our notion of time, point being that you might have 1 hour that lasts an hour and 15 minutes and 1 hour that only lasts 30 minutes. Right? I mean, the notion of having clocks with the ability to measure a distinct interval of time is something that is fairly historically new. So that Kant would then use this as a way to basically justify integer reasoning seemed just completely bizarre to me. And it also seemed to presuppose a pretty anthropocentric experience of time. So in other words, he's really pretty much presuming that our notion of how we experience time is the only possible way of experiencing time. And that's the reason I was bringing up the previous example, because I think that's just not true.
What you guys are arguing against is the notion that Kant can generalize his point, which we haven't even gotten to, by the way, that space and time are basically the structure or the form of experience that are imposed by us, but would be imposed by any rational being that, you're saying we may not be able to generalize that, not just to other creatures, but also to human beings from different epochs. But you are not arguing against or proving a point against the fact that it is a construct that we impose on experience as opposed to something that's actually out there. In fact, you're kind of supporting that point, just to make that distinction.
Yeah. Maybe one of the things that I'm trying to say is that perhaps the fact that we impose this structure but not another is just an accident of being human. I guess I'm feeling a little constructivist today.
Yeah, he's the prototypical constructionist.
Right. A lot of the way that Kant talks about metaphysics is that he talks a lot about what would it mean for metaphysics to be possible. And I think perhaps we should consider at least some reading that maybe this is Kant's sneaky way of saying, well, to what extent is it? Perhaps the question could be answered in the negative.
Oh, yeah. He wants to throw out almost all metaphysics that's been written beforehand. He calls it twaddle. Once you've done critique, you cannot read that twaddle anymore. You become purified, and the urge toward metaphysics, he says, is unavoidable, right? We all want to find out about God and immortality and everything like that. So we got to figure out a way to do it, or at least, what has failed in the past so we can see what's left. But yeah, he definitely wants to seemingly junk. He says, like, whenever I read a metaphysical treatise and I ask, did this advance the science of metaphysics one iota over Aristotle? No.
I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that tonight may be the first time in the history of mankind that urine has been used as an example to prove or demonstrate a point about metaphysics.
Thank you, Azura.
But I do like the example. As I was thinking about the same thing, I heard a comedian talking about his cats when he leaves the house, thinking that, for him, he's just going away and coming back. But maybe for the cats, it represents the death of God and his rebirth. And that the time lag, whether it's a day or 10 minutes, may represent an eternity and all that. Another good example, if anybody who has cats and sees how cats respond when you've been out of the house for a little while, also might suspect that cats have a different perception of time than human beings.
So just to sum up, he's doing a couple different things in talking about sensibility. One is just saying whatever there is out in the world, whatever the in itself, the noumena, the things in themselves are, our senses filter things through space and time, which makes them subjective. So that's one point. But then the other one is over and beyond that, as he uses this to say this founds, first he says space founds geometry, right? And that was the intuition in particular, that you don't just get the truths of geometry by postulates and then lead to axioms. You have to test them. It's not analytically true that the 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. You have to actually sort of do that image in your head to verify it. That's at least his claim there. And then he makes the same point regarding time about arithmetic, which we just talked about. Like you said, you count on the fingers or you're counting over time. So those are 3 different steps of the argument, and I think they make sense to different degrees. I'm fine with the first step, just this. We filter things by space and time. Maybe there are beings that don't see things that way. In fact, he definitely wants to be open to, like, there being a God that doesn't see things that way at all.
That's a good example. We might think of space and time as sort of goggles that we are born attached to our eyes that we can't possibly shake off or even think about what it would be like. I mean, I guess we can sort of imagine what it would be like to be without them, but at the end of the day, that is how we filter our experiences. So one example that's really popular to use is imagine that you had been born with pink goggles glued to your eyes. And that would obviously mean that you would experience the entirety of the world through, well, rose-colored glasses. And you can sort of think of space and time as being akin to that for Kant.
Yes, Azura took a class on how to teach this to undergrads, right?
Actually, one point that I might make about academic philosophy is that I haven't taken that class, nor do I think that philosophy pedagogy exists as a class. But, they throw you in the classroom often enough and you somehow pick it up.
I thought you just said you had a seminar. When we talked last, you said you had a seminar on how to teach Kant or something.
No, I went to a professional development in my department. That was just a 2-hour talk by one of my colleagues, Don Becker, on sort of how he teaches Kant in intro. And yes, that example was brought up by him. And also, if you look at Donald Palmer's book, Looking at Philosophy, I think he has a kind of a funny picture of Kant with some goggles on it that has waves coming in.
And if you're teaching really slow undergrads, should you actually bring a lot of pairs of rose-colored glasses to show them the concept? Because they won't know what you're talking about. Was that part of the seminar?
No, nor do we bring actual Play-Doh to teach Plato either.
That would be pretty good, though.
It's like if I shove this Play-Doh in your eye, it can make an impression, and then you'll remember it. So we got sensibility out there. The understanding. Sensibility is just like sense data. It's not organized. The understanding is what actually keeps it into objects, right? Object permanence, as well as causality, as well as any other relational thing, right? You're not going to even get left of and right of. Maybe I should be asking Wes this.
Well, also any properties. Predication.
Well, he says sensibility gives you space, but I would think spatial properties, like this book is to the left of my computer. Like once I turn, the fact that we are active beings, like if I was just, a stationary thing, then I would say, oh, space is given to me is like, and Kant describes it as it's an infinite vector in all directions. But the fact that we're constantly moving through space, like that means that more processing is required even for us to get the sense of the relative connections of things in space than just intuition, right?
I think you might be right. I think there's a sort of work that judgment, which is what we're talking about now, this faculty of judgment works on spatiotemporal. So to get to real objects, I think you do need more than space and time.
Right. And of course, you wouldn't have spatial relations if you didn't have objects. You couldn't say this book is to the left of the computer monitor unless you had book and computer monitor, which means you have the object, you have this perception of book, this perception of book, this perception of book. Those are all the same book. None of that comes until you have the understanding. So every bit of experience really involves both of these faculties working at the same time.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of interesting that we think of book as being one object, but if I were able to experience the molecules that make up this book, I probably would think of it as, many moles of object.
Yeah, and that's what Kant calls community, those types of part-whole relationships where you can analyze objects into constituents and treat them as objects is also grounded by one of his categories.
So, Mark, you were going to talk about sort of different components to the whole structure. Sensibility, understanding. Judgment.
Well, reason was the other one. But, right, judgment that Wes brought up, judgment is the act by which we bring sensibilities under concepts, right? Understanding deals with concepts. So the concept of a book, the concept of a physical object, the concept of causality, whatever, these are all things that the understanding brings in. Concepts always, they refer to multiple things. You don't have a concept that's just for this one thing. Even if you're pointing out this one thing, even if it's I found a unicorn, it's the only unicorn that exists. Well, the fact that I'm calling it unicorn means I'm conceptualizing it, which means if there were another unicorn, I would recognize it as the same thing. So there's even a concept of God, even though presumably, if you're Kant, there's only one God.
And one important thing here to note is that what he calls these pure concepts of the understanding are important to injecting necessity and objective validity into particular judgments. So when you notice a particular causal relation, like the sun makes me warm, the more general everything has a cause principle injects the required objective necessity into that particular causal relation. So there's this relationship between these higher level principles of pure quote-unquote natural science and then the actual propositions that you get when you do natural science. So in the same way that, you get pure intuitions of space and time undergirding math, you get these pure principles of the understanding undergirding scientific knowledge.
Yep. And I guess the general rule through all these things is that the only way we get certainty is if we're the ones who made it up.
Exactly.
Right? So the only reason that we know that everything is going to be spatial and temporal is because we're the ones who are injecting space and time into it. The only reason we know for sure that everything has a cause that we could possibly experience is because we're the ones injecting that concept of causality into the world of experience.
Exactly. And he says that, if we had access to the things in themselves, that would make knowledge impossible, right? That's where you sort of get the fortuitous consequence of widening Humean skepticism concerning causality and making it apply to everything, making it apply to space and time and other concepts of the understanding. Once everything gets sucked in and you say, okay, well, the thing in itself is actually inaccessible and these judgments aren't really about things in themselves, they're about these constructed objects that we have immediate access to, then you fortuitously get objectivity back into the whole system.
How does he get around the problem of the interpersonal part of objectivity?
He talks about that, right? Objectivity just means universality, which means consistency over time and between subjects.
And he uses this beautiful word, apodeictic, throughout, which I think is just...
Yeah.
Isn't it just apodictic?
Isn't that the pronunciation? I think it's apodictic, meaning demonstrable. This idea of intersubjectivity, right? You get objectivity because of the fact that human beings have, let's say, the same structures to their minds, so that even though we're sort of making mincemeat in our relations to the things in themselves, right? They're not coming in unfiltered. We still get objectivity because we're doing the same filtering. We're all doing the same filtering, and so we'll have agreement with each other, and that's by definition objectivity, where you can come to the same object, different people can come to the object and see the same thing, and you come back into the room where your desk was, and because it hasn't been moved, it's the same object. Things don't just move around as they would in a dream. And, again, that's part of the task here, is to distinguish disorganized, subjective experience from objective experience.